Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. This is the lecture and a live demonstration for edges in painting. Edges is really one of my favorite themes to talk about. The line has no substance and therefore is not part of the nature. What Leonardo da Vinci is talking about is his own observation of life, where the edges, the areas of change between one object to another or object to air, is not made by line in nature, but by change of value and color. It's probably one of the most important observations made that will change painting forever. Because if there is no line in life, there shouldn't be a line in painting, not unless it's artistic choice. But in the history of art, the way people learned to paint and the way there were limitations of the medium that they used, starting from a cave painting, the painting was always linear, and it continued to be linear all the way through Egyptian art, medieval art, and all the way to the Renaissance. And here we have a slide of Hans Holbein. And you can see how in his painting, there is a lot of silhouettes, there is a lot of sharp edges, there's a lot of emphasis on the linearity of the painting. It almost feels like a beautifully colored drawing. It doesn't yet have a paint quality, lost edges, and interaction of the background with this object, which is a portrait of the woman. So here we see Sandra Botticelli. Again, the edges are treated very linear. The separation of the eyes done by line, the nose, the contour of the face, even the linear shapes of the hair and how the braid is divided. So that's what painting looked for a long time in history, till about 1600s. Till we have Leonardo da Vinci, whose quote we started with. And what he observed, he translated in this new invention, which he is credited for, called sfumato. And it's clouding and fogging up the edges and creating a softer transition between the form. When we look at his painting, it's not yet fully painting with using a lot of paint and a lot of brushstroke. It's still very soft and smooth because Leonardo da Vinci believed that the artist is a medium, that the painting is done through the artist with God's inspiration. But you already see almost no linear quality, and that beautiful sfumato, the fogginess, the softness between the transitions of light and shadow and the transitions of the form into the background is really revolutionized and changes the way the painting will develop from now on. So then we go a little bit further in time to Titian, to Venice. Titian is Venetian painter. And you can see a further development into softening the form and softening the edges, relaxing them. And you can see how now his form, yet it's isolated, but you can see the attempts of bringing the darkness of the background to the closer value to his black coat, to bring and soften the edges more together. And also using light to direct the eye to the focal point. So now painting becomes more of a storytelling by using light and using edges to direct their eyes into the face. Interesting fact, Titian lived till about 70 years old. And when he was 60, he said, "I'm finally learning how to paint." That's after he was a court painter for many decades. So that gives us a hope that we can continue and learn more and more about painting. To genius Rembrandt, who changed the course of the painting forever. What Rembrandt did at the age when he did it, in the surrounding of what was done at that time was so out of the time and out of the place that it's really a stroke of genius. And so now he employs the quality of paint, how thick and thin, how transparent and opaque, to create a different quality of edges. The paint interacts with each other. It doesn't just blend. It pushes in and out of its shape, creating the most beautiful edge work. And notice how also Rembrandt, of course, famous for chiaroscuro that started by Caravaggio, but again, that dramatic Baroque light that leads your eye and makes you experience painting by following the light. This is one of the things that we're going to talk a little bit later, how the eye works. The eye always follows the light. So Rembrandt was one of the first ones to really bring that idea into the painting, well, I should say with Caravaggio, and make it a key to his painting. The way we read his painting is by light, and whatever is not important gets blurred and merged into the darkness. And in the next slide, I'm using another painting by Rembrandt from his early periods, and you can see how the paint is still very soft and smooth. But here, it's just a nice example of the edges. So what kind of edges do we have? To simplify edges, we only have two kinds. One exterior that belongs to the outer form, and the other edge is interior edge, which we called inside edge or the form edge. This is the edge that's created by a single light source where the light streaming around the form and down the form, meeting the shadow shape. So starting edge of the shadow is a soft and open edge, and we call it interior edge. An exterior edge symbolizes either the beginning of form or the end of the form. And those edges should always be defined, relatively hard to the inside edge. And we always going to specify in painting that everything is relative. When I say hard, I don't necessarily mean a razor sharp, linear hard. It may be a degree of hardness in a relationship to the softest edge that you would have. So your interior edge would always be soft, for an exception of some cast shadows, and your exterior edge would always be defined for the reason that we always need to know, at least partially, where the object begins and where the object ends. And the beginning and the end of those exterior edges are all one and the same. They are synonymous, because where one thing's end, the other one begins. So the hair ends, the ear, the background begins, or the other shape. So it's one of the same. And now I'm going to talk about our perception, how physically our eyes set up, and how we are conditioned through history as humans develop to process the visual information. Once we understand how we see and what influences us, then we can use those concepts in the painting. One of the most important things to know is that our eyes are focusing instruments. We have a lens that when we look at something, whatever we look, whatever comes to our consciousness becomes sharper. And that really creates a problem with working with the edges. We cannot determine the quality of the edge, how sharp or how soft we should make it, just by looking at the edge. Because the minute we look at the edge, it becomes sharper. It comes to full visibility, while peripheral vision blurs the information that is not important at this moment. So the other thing is that our eyes see by contrast. We are attracted to the most contrast, the dark and the light. So we're talking about the value change. So all edges are created mostly by contrast. The sharper the edge, the more contrast you would have. The light and the dark changes and creates the border or the edge of sudden abrupt change. But if you have a low contrast, a value, or the color, for example, the yellow-green comes to a very subtle change of blue-green of the same value. The contrast is very low. And so the edges, instead of being linear and abrupt and hard, will become more integrated and softer. This is an important concept to remember when you're designing your painting, when you're composing your still life or setting up the model. The edges that you're going to be solving are actually made even when you're setting up the model. For example, if the model is a blonde-haired and dressed in a white dress, if you want her silhouette to be separated, you would put a dark background or a strong color background. But if your idea is to blend the model back into the space, then you would use a similar value background to the coloration of the model. The visual problems that you set up becomes a part of your solutions. The other perception that we have, the way our eyes and the brain works and the process of visual information, is that we have blind spots, that the brain cannot take in all the information around it. We would then just have an overload. So what we have is the gaps. And the visual information comes as almost like a dots, and the brain is able to fill the gaps and connect the dots. Knowing this is important in the way you paint. What it means simply that you can be a little lazy. You don't need to describe everything to the very detail, that it actually the opposite. The good idea is to leave things undone in some ways, more open and less detailed, so the brain can do the rest for you. And the viewer's attention becomes more involved in those kinds of paintings that leave some of the information for imagination, for the viewer's brain to finish it. We are conditioned to follow the light. If you're in a dark room and there is a little light somewhere, your attention will immediately switch to that light. We don't pay attention to the shadows unless we are artists, and we have to have shadows to support the light, to hold the light, and to contrast the light. But people from every day, they won't look at the shadows. They just pay attention to the light, because light is what tells the story. It describes the surfaces. It shows you the relative positions, the relative sizes. It helps you navigate the space. So that's an important part of us as painters, to really give more attention to the light and use the light as a compositional device to design the experience of the viewer, how he reads or she reads your painting, and how you bring the viewer to the focal point. And the next slide, I just said that because the edges cannot be solved with our eyes, we solve them by our aesthetics, by what we consider beautiful. And also we solve by many other ways, as, for example, atmospheric perspective, the rules of far to near, where the near edges close to us will be sharper, the distant edges will be softer. So the solutions of the edges actually come from how we think of it. not how we see it. And that alone opens up a whole array of stylistic changes. So here I just picked four paintings of hands, and you can see the first on the top is so beautifully painted with such a sensitivity to the edges, and not one edge looks like a line. Notice how that small highlight on the three nails really brings your attention, because that's the brightest light, the sharpest edge, and the smallest size, the coolest temperature placed on the warmest spot of the painting. So all of those ingredients adds to being a focal point to bring your attention to them. And of course, it's also the place of the high contrast. The second hands next to it, almost graphic in the sense that the brushstroke is so defined and muscular and energetic, has a total different feel to it. It lacks the softness, but it has a determination. So you can see how the edge work can really create an emotion in the painting, and the speed of the read, how the reading of the second hands are much faster. With the first sergeant hands, you can stay for a long time and explore the way they painted. That's just my opinion. And then the ones on the bottom are really more of a rendered hands, closer maybe to a drawing rather than a paint, in the way that they use the paint as more of a coloring tool rather than a sculpting tool, making the space out of the paint, using the quality and the difference in the brushstroke application and the paint application. But again, not to take the way they beautifully done and the way they express. On the last hands, I would just say that sometimes giving too much details to the texture creates a feeling of repetition and overdone. We do feel the loose skin and the older hands and the crookedness of arthritis fingers, but it almost feels like that there's nothing left for us to finish in this painting. Let's go to the next slide. And in the next slide, again, I'm going to use four different profiles to show you the difference of the stylistic edge solutions and how they developed in the history of art. We're looking at William Adolphe Bouguereau, a French academic painter, the painter that painted at the time when Impressionists would rebel against the French Academy painting. And you can see how hard Bouguereau is trying to separate that profile from the background. The edge quality doesn't change significantly. And this is why, because classical painting wanted to be very precise, very clear communication, without much of a mystery, without dissolving the form into the space. And therefore, when you look at the full paintings of Bouguereau, it's such a feast for their eyes. There is so much to see, and every detail seems so beautifully painted and so important, because again, that clarity of the edge work in a general sense of the painting is how he solves the majority of the edge problem. Let's look at the next slide. And there, Albert Herter, notice how his solution of the background, having it a highly patterned and a very abstract, beautiful changes of subtle colors, changes the readability of the linearity of the edge work of that profile. The forehead gets lost, the point of the nose gets pushed towards us. Again, the edges of the slope from the lip gets lost. There is a sequence of lost and found edges, which makes that portrait look more alive and more real and more existing in its environment and its space. Beautifully painted painting. Let's look at another. I couldn't resist putting a Russian painter, Alexei Harlamov. This is a painting portrait of Georgian princess. And here I want to point out how much mystery he brings into the painting. Look how behind the nose, the form is completely disappeared into the darkness of the lace of the headdress. Notice how the shoulder on the back is just a dark shape. There is no definition, nearly not as important as the beautiful shoulder that is made coming forward by some clarity and the sharpness of the edges, as well as using the opposite colors of the fabric, a saturated cooler red and a warmer greener design on the top of the shoulder. Notice how the background is just another variation of what she's dressed in. It's a warmer red with the warmer greens to complement the dress, but yet to be different enough to move back. Notice the beautiful sfumato, the fogginess of the shapes. They're not defining the transitions and the edges of the eye, yet that little corner look really attracts your attention. And again, as a humans in a portrait, we're conditioned to make an eye contact. So we don't need to overwork our edges in that area to bring the eye towards the eyes of the viewer. We can do it by a contrast and leave the soft edges softer, so there is more of a feeling of softness of the skin and the features. Use the contrast to bring the viewer towards their eyes. Let's look at one more profile, Konstantin Curtis, a contemporary painter, almost like a Rembrandt style painting with a strong contrast, with a strong use of light, and also because of how he uses this paint. Heavy, chunky paint to draw your attention to the focal point, as well as notice how on the shoulder that sculptural paint creates a beautiful sharp edge that is attracting your attention on the way to the face. Notice how the background is abstractly painted, and yet it feels like the back of the figure is dissolving and evaporating into the background. Let's look at one more. And another contemporary painter, which I really like, and a beautiful colorist, using colors and edges in a very abstract way. It could be an abstract painting. That's just a little indication of the profile of that face, makes it more figurative. But the way the shapes, the paint application, and the edge work is done, it's abstract and beautiful use of color. And here I want to talk about functions of the edges, why edges are so important in the painting. Number one, and this is what I'm going to do a demonstration on, is edges help to create form. It helps to create the illusion of form through the creating illusion of depth, moving some edges back by defining the difference of how soft and hard, how defined or vague they are. It also, as we talk about, defines the form by starting light edge and softer form edge and define shadow edge, the finish of shadow. Number two, another function of edges is to describe tactile quality of the surface. The difference between the softness and the hardness, the heaviness and the lightness, the feather and the brick, the peach and the nectarine, the silk and the burlap. That tactile quality difference is described by the quality of a highlight and by the edges, how fast or slow the edge turns. And I will talk about that in demonstration. Also, another function of the edges is to control the value. This is a little bit more advanced, but basically it comes down that the sharper the edge, the brighter the value looks. When we soften the edge on the same value, understanding of perception becomes more vague. And because it vagues, the mind reads that value as a darker value. So edge becomes an important tool to change the look of the value without changing the value itself. So if I want this to be brighter and this to be less light, without changing a value to go lighter or darker, I'm going to put the same stroke of the same paint, the same value, and just sharpen the edge. And here I'm going to soften the edge. How I'm going to do the edge itself, maybe by contrast, where I have the dark next to the light, and here light next to the light to soften the contrast. Or maybe I'll pull that paint into the adjacent shape. That would be a different conversation. There is many ways of doing it, but the fact that the quality of edge will demand a different amount of attention, making the same value look lighter or darker, that's something as a painters we should really use to our advantage. And the last one, and very, very important one, is to create compositional flow and the sense of structure in our composition. The edges in the composition create a flow that allows us to enter one shape and leave and come into the next. And the sharp edges creates a stops, which create a stronger structure for your composition. So the combination and the balance between the flow and the stop is a function of the edges. Opening the edges create an open channel, closing the edges and sharpening them, defining it, creates the structure. Let's go to the next slide. This is a painting by my teacher that I absolutely adore, David Leffel. And he's painting in a Rembrandt style, the dramatic Baroque light and shadow, the light set up as a stage. The light is used to read the composition and to lead the viewer's eye through the composition. And this painting is beautifully harmonized. But the reason why I used it, because I want to show you how the quality of the edge describes the quality of objects. Sharp edges in our minds always associated with something that's thin. So the piece of paper, thin leaves, anything that has a thin edge will demand a sharper edge. So you can see how the edges on those petally plant, for the most part, have enough sharpness for us to know that they are flat and thin. When we look at the glass being transparent, the quality of that transparency defined by softening and losing the edges. The reason we see that glass is by what we see the light doing inside of the glass, but not so much by the outer edges. They are very relaxed and almost lost. So the transparency of objects are communicated by relaxing the starting and finish outer edges. And then the small bird feeder is a typical example of painting opaque objects where you have a starting light edge, which is defined, receiving a lot of light, moving across the form and creating a form edge, which is softer, that is talking about continuity of form and the form moving away from light into the shadow. And then the shadow edge, again, is partially defined for us to know where is that form ends. So the beginning and the end is partially defined, and the form edge is softer, creating a turning of the form and continuity of it. And this is just a few more examples how two different artists, one of them is Sherry McGraw, defines metal. And again, metal will have the same quality of the edges as glass, except for a different reason. Of course, metal is heavy, but it has a reflective quality. It's shiny, and so it absorbs the colors from atmosphere, from around objects, and from the background, losing the definition of the edge to a certain degree, some more, some less, but those outer edges become softer while our attention is focused on the middle of the form, which is picked up by a strong, dancing, beautifully impasta highlight. So that's the importance of edges in describing the metal. Again, just look how many edges are relaxed and softened and lost. The next slide about importance edges in composition. The quality of edges, of course, the edges can be defined, vague, hard, soft, open, and closed. But notice how the artist merges the shapes of the same value together to create a bigger shapes and create the softer and lost edges for the eyes to move, especially on the first slide, to move around the face. It's almost like the dark hair is a framework around the face, and how one face of the model in front of us is the most lit up and the most contrasted with most amount of sharper edges that is demanding the most attention from us, focusing our eye on it. It becomes a focal point. But relaxation of the other edges allows us to create this linear quality of faces just floating on top of those shapes. So again, lost open edges created channels, a flow that allows the viewer's eye to come in and out of its forms and travel through the painting. The next slide is about that opening the edges, the lost edges creates openness in the painting and creates the feeling of largeness in the painting and allows the focal point to be more dominant compared to if every edge was in contrast or in definition. Here I put together two paintings, one where artist uses lighter values to lose the forms, and another where the darkness is how the shapes and forms are lost. And you can see how in both the light becomes dominant and dark, and the shadow silhouette of the face becomes dominant in the light. The lost open edges create possibilities. Our mind can fill the gaps and involves our own imaginations and forces us to be actively participate in the experience of that painting. And this is a painting by Serge Martin, a Russian painter. He's walking almost a classical way of painting, and you can see how the treatment of the figure is more contour oriented, more linear, a definition, a clarity of the form, which creates a solidity of that form that she is very solid, she's very palpable. You can see a strong presence of her, but at the same time, the definition of those edges being overly linear, overly defined, leaves very little mystery and very little for us as viewers to do to finish that painting. Different level of engagement, I think. But again, not to take anything away from a beauty of this painting, just a different edge solutions, a different style of painting. And then next slide, we're gonna see how the artist solved the problem of background versus the silhouettes, light against the dark. More contrast really defines the whole shape, even though the artist makes attempt to soften the edges. The contrast is still makes that silhouette very readable. Relative to Rembrandt, his focal point is a face, and he's making the decision about everything in the painting, whether it's the hair, the dress, to be submerged in a relative the same quality of value, paint, brush stroke, and the edge solution. So only the face really what matters in the painting, and everything else becomes the same and moves back with the face coming forward towards us. And this is a painting that has very little contrast. White on white is an interesting problem to solve, but unfortunately, the lack of contrast creates a low visual impact. And so sometimes those paintings can look a little repetitive and a little, sorry to say for me, boring. And this painter made a beautiful painting of the figure in the face, and yet his choice of using lines flattens the sense of that dimensionality, the illusion of form. But we started this lecture with a quote of Leonardo, where he said, "The line doesn't belong in nature." But as we see, the line can be an important element of design. And so it becomes artistic choice, whether it's Gauguin, Van Gogh, and Cézanne that used the line to separate the objects from the background. This is now more about stylistic, aesthetic choices rather than just observing the truth of nature. And the last slide is a whole different spectrum of using the edges for the painting, more modernized, and where edge may not serve you for the purposes of building the form, but it certainly entertains our eye and creates a certain beauty. So on this, I'm going to finish slide lecture. There is so much information to share. And before I start my demonstration, what I want to say that I teach a style of painting that is more sculptural painting. And to make the edge work, it starts from how you hold the brush, because the control of how you release the paint on the canvas becomes a very important element. So the way we hold the brush, and on my YouTube channel, Art Horizon, I have 2 videos that explain that in a great details if you need more information. But just quickly, we will put the brush into the soft part of our hand between pointing finger, thumb, and then we will hold our brush very lightly without grasping it too hard and making our knuckles white. And then we balance the brush. Notice that the brush is thin to the end and thicker to the edge. So it's balanced by weight. You don't need to grip and pressure the brush. When you want to leave a lot of paint, a thick pasta, or overpaint something, overpaint light over dark, you will approach the canvas in a very flat way. Your brush will be parallel to the canvas, and you will slide the brush. Of course, first you will put a lot of paint, so there is a cushion between your brush and your canvas or your board, and you will just slide the brush and pull the brush towards the end of the brush. When you want to move the paint and make the paint lesser, you can use the brush approaching the canvas 45 degrees and make that brush be almost like a scraper, or moving the paint in the right position. So we will make the brush, or this way, the way you apply the paint to the canvas already creates a different quality of edge. With more pressure, it will be sharper. With a relaxing the pressure, it will be softer.